And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, March 24th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, the U.S. is pushing back on foreign data sovereignty rules, and it could reshape how global companies handle their information. Plus, GSA has issued its first ever acquisition clause aimed squarely at artificial intelligence, and contractors are already warning it could be a game changer. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. Federal employees are reporting significantly diminished engagement in their jobs and declining views of political leadership. New survey results from the Partnership for Public Service show major drops in satisfaction and morale during 2025. That's after a year of upheavals across the federal workforce. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
The partnership ran its own survey this year. Why did they choose to take that course?
So this comes after the Office of Personnel Management around mid-2025 decided to cancel the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, or FEVS for short. That's the first time that OPM chose not to run that government-wide survey since it began more than 20 years ago. So that was a pretty significant decision. And from there, the partnership said that they were concerned about what would have been a major gap in workforce data, especially considering how many significant changes there were for federal employees throughout 2025. And they felt that having some sort of assessment, even if it wasn't going to be at the same scale that FEVS can be at least having some survey would be important to keep that data continuing on. So, the results cannot be compared directly, but I think there are still very significant trends here. Max Stier, who's the president and CEO of the partnership, said that the results are largely consistent with many of the other research projects that the partnership has conducted recently and what they've been finding about federal employees. He spoke a little bit about that recently.
Federal employees have suffered a layer cake of trauma. The ultimate impact has been crushing on their morale, as these numbers suggest. This is consistent with all of the anecdotal information that we've gotten. We talked to thousands of employees through our various programming, and the messaging has been consistently that they are fearful, that they are being mistreated. Again, you have a leadership group that wanted to traumatize them, and they in fact did so.
Well, that would lead right into the partnership's overall findings on engagement. What do their survey results show us?
The overall engagement score from employees was 32 out of 100. That was after also that finding that nearly 60% of the survey respondents said that engagement with work has decreased since 2024. This was conducted in November and December of 2025. So for context, it's just as employees are coming out of a government-wide shutdown, or a very large government shutdown, combined with the other changes that took place throughout the year. In total, the partnership had about 11,000 or so respondents to the survey, and that was across 17 large agencies and 13 mid-size agencies. If you compare that to FEVS, they get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of responses, so it's a much smaller scale. But Stier said, even so, the results are a major warning signal.
The top line is deeply distressing. We have every red light blinking across the entire federal government. Morale is as low as imaginable, but it's a deeply distressing story. This is true across the entire federal government. There is no corner that has emerged unscathed.
Drew, I'm sure that you've dug through all of the details of this report. Are there any agencies that stood out to you in their results?
There were a lot of agencies that were lower than that. The government-wide average, again, which was 32 out of 100 on their employee engagement index. Some agencies were much lower than that. The State Department was at 20 out of 100. Department of Health and Human Services, which was the number 2 best place to work in government back in 2024, they scored just over 20 points out of 100 on employee engagement. Social Security Administration had the lowest score of any large agency, just 15 out of 100 on that index. And then NASA, which is long been considered the best place to work in the federal government, their employee engagement score was at 46 out of 100, so less than half on their engagement index there. So, the findings, although NASA technically was on the higher end of the scale for large agencies there were others like the Education Department and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, both of which were heavily targeted by the Trump administration. They had some of the lowest engagement scores of any agency. And I think it's also notable to point out that no agency saw an increasing engagement score.
One of the other comments that is called out in this report is survey respondents' perceptions of political leadership. What did you see there?
Those were also very low of the respondents who took this survey. Just about 7.5% of federal employees who filled out the survey said that they agreed with the statement that political leaders generate high levels of motivation in the workforce. So there's clearly this very negative perception right now of political leadership. At some agencies, it's much lower than other. Notably, at HHS, RFK Jr. is, very much perceived more negatively, I should say, than some other agency leadership. And then more broadly, there's impacts as well. For example, less than a quarter of respondents said that they felt confident that they could report if they suspected there was a violation of a law, a rule, or a regulation without experiencing retribution. So there's this sort of chilling effect, so to speak, on federal employees who feel that they're able to speak up and flag things to leadership as well.
So 2 questions then. What's the plan for this current year's data? Do we think that anyone from OPM on down in the federal government is going to take it on? And what's the plan for next year? Will FEVS be back?
For 2026, this year with FEVS, the plan is to return it at some point later in the year. When I spoke to OPM, they haven't given a specific timeline for when that would be, but we are expecting to see that come back with some changes. For example, they talked about removing questions that were previously on there about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but they're also going to be adding, I believe, some questions about poor performance in government, which has been a high interest of the Trump administration. So I think we'll see that later this year. As for the partnerships results, they've essentially implied that, this was an attempt to fill in what would have otherwise been just a complete gap in the data. So it's assumed or expected that if OPM does bring back their survey, that the partnership would no longer have a need to conduct theirs. So we'll see how this all plays out. If there's another gap, then we may see another partnership survey.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, GSA has issued its first ever acquisition clause aimed squarely at artificial intelligence, and contractors are already warning it could be a game changer. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The General Services Administration is rolling out the government's first acquisition regulation clause written specifically for artificial intelligence systems. It sets sweeping new rules on data ownership, licensing, disclosure, and who's on the hook when AI is used in contract performance. And it's raising red flags across the contracting community. We'll break down what's in the clause, who it applies to, and why industry groups are pushing back with Dan Ramish, partner at Haynes Boone. Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Thanks, Terry. Nice to talk to you.
For folks who are used to doing business with the government through contracts, they're used to receiving periodic dumps of contract clause modifications. But GSA has put a new clause out there for comment that you really want to call people's attention to. It's 552.239-7001. So what is it about this clause that is so important?
So this clause is the first acquisition regulation clause that specifically addresses AI systems. It was, as you mentioned, introduced through GSA's latest update to the multiple award schedule, Refresh 31. it has a lot in there, and it's very detailed and prescriptive in the requirements it imposes on government contractors and also on service providers, which are defined as any entities that directly or indirectly provide, operate, or license AI systems, whether or not they're subcontractors.
So this clause by itself is 9 pages. It's not an easy read. Let's kind of start with the highlights. What does it cover?
So the provisions of this clause really run the gamut from intellectual property and licensing to restrictions on government data and data handling and processing requirements, disclosure of AI use, American AI, and then incident reporting, data portability and interoperability. So really kind of spanning different types of requirements, both in terms of ownership of developments and data and security requirements and other policy requirements. So maybe to start with intellectual property rights and licensing, the clause provides that the government owns not only all government input data, but output data and custom developments. Now, output data, it wouldn't be shocking that the government wants to own the outputs from AI systems, but this includes derivative data, metadata, and logs. The custom developments providing for government ownership is contrary to the general data rights scheme in government contracts, which provides that the contractor generally owns data that's generated in contract performance and the government receives a broad license. Whereas under this clause, contractors and service providers that provide AI-related services would be prohibited from using government data, including some of those types of derivative government data, outside of the performance of the contract.
Does that limit the utility of the AI programs then?
So these practices would require changes in the way that things are typically done, and they present some other concerns. Some of it would depend on the particular AI tools that are being used, but the descriptive terms are different from what would appear in a typical commercial license.
There is a phrase in here that we've seen a lot lately in the news between DoD and Anthropic, which is for lawful purposes. How does that get incorporated into this clause proposal?
So along with the intellectual property rights, the clause also addresses parameters of the government's use rights, and it includes that clause, as you mentioned, for any lawful purpose. It also prohibits AI systems from refusing to produce data outputs or conduct analyses based on either the contractor's or the service provider's discretionary policies. And it also provides that the government has the right to integrate the AI system with government systems as necessary to do whatever it wants, lawful government purpose. And now there is this caveat that doesn't extend to retraining the model or altering model weights. But clearly the government is looking for the ability to do whatever it wants within the limits of the law and its own interpretation of the law without being constrained by contractor or service provider imposed policies.
Speaking of those imposed policies, the clause also asserts that the AI has to be unbiased, so it can't have any ideologies that aren't objective from the government's perspective, right?
Yes, that's right. Of course, when the administration is terming, some of these biases woke AI, the government has its own perspective, and every administration will have its own perspective. And so there is some room for interpretation as to what even a neutral AI would be. But there are criteria for unbiased AI described in general terms as one of the requirements in this clause. There are also important restrictions on the use of government data. Of course, unsurprisingly, restrictions on using data or custom developments to train, fine-tune, or otherwise improve AI systems. But the breadth of government data, including both input and output data and some of these types of derivative data, may make that more challenging for AI service providers.
One more of the particulars in here that I want to ask you about. It requires contractors to disclose all AI systems used in contract performance. That seems like a really big requirement.
Yes, that's one of the striking things about this clause, both the fact that it applies to the prime contractor and makes them responsible for all of the AI service providers, and also that it's not limited to contracts that involve delivery of an AI system. If a contractor is using an AI system to perform a contract that has nothing to do with AI, that would still, at least by the terms of this clause, be subject to these requirements. And this disclosure requirement is also new and notable, and there'd be an ongoing obligation, particularly given the way some large organizations are adopting AI and the government is encouraging adoption of AI, having to monitor each individual use of AI is a burdensome requirement.
Does this get to the point where the Department of Defense, as an example, would want certification that Anthropic is in no one's supply chain?
I think it's possible we could see requirements along those lines, again, recognizing that AI service providers will have their own views about this and may go to court to challenge some of these provisions.
I'm speaking with Dan Ramish. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Dan, let's move off the particulars now and talk about what you're hearing in terms of comments. What are industry players saying about this draft?
I'd say there are really three special concerns about the draft clause. The first focuses around the fact that this has so many government unique requirements. When the federal government procures commercial software and software related services, that's typically accomplished using the licenses that are customarily provided to the public. And the aim of that, of course, is that the government pays more if they buy things that are have changes from the way that software providers typically provide them to everybody else. And so that has a cost impact, has a competitive impact. And this clause is not a commercial clause. The long list of government unique requirements could act as a deterrent for AI service providers selling to the government. It may deter contractors from using AI if doing that requires all of these prescriptive obligations. The second concern that people have raised is the contractor responsibility for service providers under the clause. So many government procurement clauses include flow-down obligations. That's a kind of a standard approach to making prime contractors responsible for subcontractors, and there is a level of oversight that's expected. But this clause seems to go above and beyond in making the contractor responsible for any service providers at any tier below when AI systems are being used. And there are just practical limits as to how much control and insight a prime contractor will have into AI service providers, particularly when it comes to things in the clause that reach into providers' internal operations and processes. The other concern is timing and cost. So once the mass modification to the JSA multiple award schedule is issued, contractors will only have 60 days to accept it. And the AI clause doesn't have a phase-in period. It requires immediate implementation. And that's going to be very challenging for contractors because, of course, they have existing agreements with AI service providers. And these detailed requirements wouldn't be covered by their existing agreements. So they would risk being immediately out of compliance. There also will likely be cost impacts of some of these requirements, and there isn't a mechanism for recovering those costs.
So, Dan, you said something earlier in our conversation that I want to come back to now, that this clause seems to be in tension with the government's broader goals in terms of acquiring and implementing AI. Talk us through how this might impact innovation and competition and even attracting top AI vendors.
Well, Terry, there are competing interests here, right? The federal government is not like any buyer of AI in the commercial setting. There are special concerns around the use of government data, and there are greater stakes when it comes to AI governance if you're dealing with matters of national concern. On the other hand, there are industry standards that are evolving in real time as to what terms AI service providers use. And having clauses that deviate substantially from the way everyone else is doing business will really hinder the government's ability to adopt AI. And this administration has been particularly outspoken about intending to get all the benefits of AI, being a leader in AI. And it'll be difficult to do that if they're not willing to buy AI on terms that are closer to what commercial buyers are using.
So this really is the first acquisition clause, as you've said, that's specifically focused on AI systems. What precedent do you think this sets going forward?
I think this will trigger a conversation about some of the key points in government procurement of AI when it comes to government governance and security and intellectual property and data usage constraints. And American AI usage. We didn't even mention that. There are requirements around using AI and not using foreign AI. A lot of policy considerations. And I think this will help advance the conversation and air out the issues. The comment deadline was originally March 20th, so just 2 weeks, and GSA extended that deadline an additional 2 weeks. So hopefully they will take the opportunity to get further input from industry, maybe even as they start to read some of the comments, further extend that deadline and give more thought to what the minimum requirements are for procuring AI and whether some of these constraints are at cross purposes with some of their broader goals for adopting AI use. One last point I wanted to raise. There is also an immediate concern for GSA schedule contractors that are facing the prospect of a mod containing this clause with the refresh. And there are potential bases for challenging the propriety of the clause as inconsistent with procurement regulations and not having followed notice and comment requirements. And contractors may simply not be able to implement the clause when the mod rolls out. So contractors would need to register their objection and reserve their rights with the contracting officer before the end of the 60-day deadline.
By way of an update, GSA has now clarified that based on the industry request for an extension of the comment period, GSA will not be including the clause in the upcoming multiple award schedule refresh 31, but will instead consider it for refresh 32. We'll continue to stay tuned.
I've been speaking with Dan Ramish. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Dan, I really appreciate you walking through this important issue. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, we'll follow up on this conversation by looking at how contractors are weighing how AI fits into rules that weren't built for it. But first, the U.S. is pushing back on foreign data sovereignty rules, and it could reshape how global companies handle their information. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The administration is telling American diplomats to challenge foreign data localization laws, raising fresh concerns for firms that move data across borders. Those rules are multiplying overseas, creating real tension for companies already navigating privacy, compliance, and fast-moving AI demands. To understand the practical implications of this new approach, I'm joined by Robert Cruz, Vice President for Regulatory and Information Governance at SMARSH. Mr. Cruz, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
The Trump administration has formally directed U.S. diplomats to push back on foreign data sovereignty and localization rules. This seems to me a change in strategy, a change in focus. Let's talk about what those changes mean. From your perspective, how significant is this direction?
I think it's fairly significant considering what's happening in the world today. And I think it's really highlighting the importance of data. So, the fact is for a lot of technology, access to information is really what drives innovation. And so the message here that I'm interpreting is, we really need access to in order to ensure that our data models are complete and accurate, are powerful, and localization and sovereignty rules just make that much more complex.
We've been discussing this issue for a while now. I mean, the GDPR in Europe was sort of the introduction to the conversation. Europe has passed its AI Act and some others. As you think about this guidance, it talks about raising costs, limiting AI and cloud services. How real are those risks, and what's the impact for U.S. firms?
I think the costs are real because when firms have to make a decision of where information can live, where and how it needs to be accessed, that just creates much more complexity when they look to deploy solutions that have a global footprint. So sorting out the complexity takes time, it adds cost. But I think the likelihood is very real that it's reflecting a divergence in philosophies across different regulatory bodies, for one, some of which are more prescriptive in nature, like the EU AI Act, and others are more principles based. And that's one division you're starting to see for things like AI regulation. It's just a lot of different points of view and perspectives that firms have to reconcile across different jurisdictions.
Speaking of governance bodies, the cable invites people to participate in the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules Forum. Is that a real organization? Tell us about that.
I don't know how or what the formal structure is behind it. I think it's one of the things that I think collectively trading partners have tried to implement things as replacement to existing frameworks to make it easier for individuals and firms to be able to transfer and leverage information across borders. This is something that I know that's being addressed as well through the EU AI Act, which basically is trying to make costs associated with transfers go away. So I think this body is another one in that effort to make sure that there's greater transparency and fluidity of information as it moves across borders. What are its enforcement mechanisms, and is that going to be comparable to what we see with GDPR and other regulatory bodies? Unclear, or at least I have not seen prescriptive guidance or kind of clarity on kind of how this would actually be implemented.
You implied that at the core of this are really diverging philosophies about privacy and handling data. The EU has really been tightening its grip on cross-border data movement with those laws that we mentioned, the GDPR and the AI Act. So if you're a multinational firm and you're thinking about different governance structures in different regions, how do you make sense of these different philosophies? I think
reconciliation is very complicated. The horizon scanning that firms have to do to make sure that they know what the developments are in the markets they choose to serve is vital. It's like you can't shortcut that process. So, as we talk to a company that says we'd like to deploy in these markets in Europe, these markets in Asia, it takes a lot of homework up front to know not only are there jurisdictional requirements, how severely are the penalties if you violate those provisions, and what are the mechanisms to work with those so that if you need to provide access, you can do that without having to store the data physically within those jurisdictions. So it's adding complexity and time. But I think a lot of firms that have done this realize that it's a very fluid picture that they have to pay attention to, make sure they've got resources in those markets or advisory staff that can keep them apprised of developments.
I'm speaking with Robert Cruz. He's Vice President for Regulatory and Information Governance at SMARSH. The European approach seems to be very focused on protecting the privacy of the individual. China's approach here seems to be a little bit different, more focused on industrial competition. Talk to us a little bit about the scope of those differences.
Yeah, that's a great question, because ultimately that is, in some cases, countries saying we will be a leader in AI, as a nation, and we're going to protect the innovation, and the data that's going to help us to get there. So you see that from China. You also see that in markets where focus is more around how do you identify and mitigate risks, much more than it is trying to free up innovation and, a very aggressive use of AI. So you see that difference, even within the EU and the UK, a difference in philosophy. So if you're working in markets that also have AI innovation centers, it's really making sure that you can understand how they are trying to grow that industry to see if that aligns with the perspectives of those countries you serve here, whether you're headquartered in the US or elsewhere. So it's really knowing kind of what is the objective that the government brings, because those are being directly translated into regulatory obligations in industries. So you really need to get a picture of kind of what that overall objective those nations have before making these investments.
If we could posit that the EU approach and the Chinese approach are sort of the opposite poles on the spectrum of how regions or governments are handling data movement, data portability, and privacy, where would you put the United States on that spectrum, given this new cable and guidance?
Oh, it's clear. I think the U.S.'s perspective, at least with this administration, is to encourage innovation. They want firms to move faster, not just in AI, but also in crypto. And so the regulatory philosophy and approach is going to be provide some principles, but ensure that firms can move quickly in being able to consume and leverage this technology. So you see the regulatory philosophy directly tracking back to what the administration is trying to accomplish, which is to be the leader in AI, as well as within crypto. That's a stated mission. So you see the U.S. on the side of just let's free the administrivia and all the constraints that just cause firms to have to wait and encourage them to innovate and move faster.
That seems to present two problems. One is a lack of guidance and governance, and two is a risk to individual privacy. How do you see those two concerns getting balanced out in the U.S. approach?
It's very intertwined. I mean, if you look at what's happening with AI, it's very similar to the whole process we saw with the following GDPR. That firms have to make a decision. What are the controls I need to build? Do I take a very least common denominator, or do I look at the most rigorous standard and apply that? We see firms moving in that direction. If I'm doing business with a citizen of the EU, they have rights, and I need to make sure I understand what those are, and that has to be reflected in the way that I'm building up my control set. So, I think the privacy exercise, it's not ideal. Nobody likes the fact that we've got this complex patchwork at the U.S. state level that has to be reconciled internationally. But I feel like we're heading down the same course with AI, with state level regulation, and just the need to try to balance all these conflicting ways that states, nations, allies, and enemies are thinking about this.
We touched at the beginning of our conversation on the costs of this variability, right? So there is a cost for choosing the most extreme compliance and thinking that will cover you in any exigency. There's a cost for not having clear guidance and the friction that comes from that. So if you're a corporation, whether you're U.S. based or based somewhere else, how do you balance these costs and your strategy for navigating all of these different frameworks?
That's a great question. It's the magic ball sort of outcome here, because it's the cost complexity, but I think the bigger challenge is just the uncertainty because of what's happening in the world today. The question becomes, can you really trust your trading partners? Can I be confident that the rights mandated in a privacy regulation are going to be adhered to by my trading partner? I think that's the biggest question firms are faced with right now, and that's really there's no answer other than we need to see how our alliances will work together to make sure that if I say that I'm going to adhere to a privacy regulation elsewhere, that we follow through and actually do that. So I think the trust element and just the confidence that I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do is probably where firms have to be thinking today. But the complexity part of this is just you need to have systems that are very agile and responsive to change, because that's inevitable that these things will continue to evolve.
Assuming that you were providing guidance then to those firms in light of the situation that we've just discussed, what would be the first step that you'd tell a multinational corporation to take right now to make sure they're not caught in the clash between these competing privacy and data regimes?
Well, it's always great, operational planning and what is plan B? What is your fallback if this doesn't materialize the way you expect? So just, looking at different scenarios of if there is a country level mandate for jurisdictional assurance, and if that is implemented, then how else might you be able to manage your obligations at a regional level? Is there another approach that you can provide access to data? So you have to think through those contingencies. But I think the other element is making sure that you know who you're doing business with, because so many firms are dependent upon others. The third-party risk management here is huge. And if I have partners that work with me to deliver a solution in a particular geographic market, what are those third-party capabilities? Do they have the flexibility, the agility to respond to change? And in particular, in the era of AI, there's a lot of shiny objects. There's a lot of tools that may or may not have an understanding and capacity to deal with things that are happening at a regional level. So that third-party risk management thing really hits me as an area that firms have to be very aware going in that you have the right partners.
I've been speaking with Robert Cruz. He's Vice President for Regulatory and Information Governance at SMARSH. Really appreciate you giving us some insight into this fast-moving space.
I really appreciate your time.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, as GSA prepares its next schedule refresh, contractors are weighing how AI fits into rules that weren't built for it. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. We've been talking about what's changing in GSA's multiple award schedule and how contractors will have to respond. The next question is how industry is reacting, especially as agencies try to buy AI through systems that weren't designed for it. To take us there, I'm joined by Jim Carroll, CEO of the Professional Services Council. Jim, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Terry. It's always good to be on.
Earlier today, I had an interview with Dan Ramish talking about the legal details of GSA's new draft mass mod on artificial intelligence. I know that you are spending a lot of time talking to industry about that. Let's start with kind of what's at stake in this mod for contractors, especially when it comes to AI and emerging technologies.
Absolutely. And, the multiple award schedule, the MAS, is just that. It's a great platform to allow consistent, good vendors to be able to sell their commercial products prearranged. It's a very efficient way to do business. And overall, it's something that our members support, and it's good government. It creates efficiency. So as a whole, we're very supportive of the MAS, and the concept of a refresh is valid also. But there are some concerns with the way that it has been published, and we've been talking with our members. Terry, we represent 400 members, all who do business with the federal government. So this is something that we have been watching closely. We've been interacting I'd like to say daily, but really it seems like an hourly, since this was really a short time period to respond, to make sure that we're addressing some of the concerns while keeping in mind what the government really wants to do. The concern overall is that the comment period, the implementation timeline are quick. We're having to move very quickly. I think our policy folks that are working on this, I don't think they slept much over the weekend trying to assemble all these comments. And Terry, it sort of seems like we're never able to come on the show and say, oh my gosh, it's such a slow week with the federal government. And this certainly is proving that. So one is they're trying to move quickly, which again, we're happy to do that, but a little bit of a concern that they don't understand that this is actually a very complicated modification. And while we completely support the idea of safeguarding the artificial intelligence systems, it's a little bit rigid of a rulemaking process, a concept of what they're doing. And so we're putting together, the response, and we're really trying hard to negotiate and make sure that they understand this. One of the concerns, for example, Terry, is it doesn't seem to align. The proposed rule from GSA on the MAS seems to be a little bit contrary to some of the other AI rules and regulations that other departments and agencies have come out with. And so, we're trying to incorporate all of that into it. Again, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, consistency and efficiency are great. It's great for the government. It's great for our members. But when you start having different federal departments and agencies with different guidelines, it kind of makes you scratch your head like, whoops, they don't understand. And so that's what we're working hard on.
Well, Jim, I suspect that some of your comments and work with GSA helped motivate the extension of the comment period. But as you're thinking through some of the internal conflicts that you just mentioned, from a contractor's perspective, what are the real-world challenges of trying to align AI? It's so fast-moving. It changes so much. And procurement structures were not designed with AI in mind. So how are your constituents dealing with that lack of clarity?
Boy, what a great question. It is evolving so quickly. And one of the things that worries us is that because it's evolving so quickly, it's actually inconsistent with the existing FAR Part 12 for commercial item principles, that I don't think that they have had the opportunity to really understand and allow some flexibility in this going forward. I mean, we're seeing AI change really overnight, every day, not just last night, but tonight. We'll wake up tomorrow and see more changes with AI. We'll talk about this hopefully in a second. We're actively involved in the AI space with our members. We had one of our folks go through the 400 member companies of PSC. More than half list AI on their homepage because everyone is using it. It is evolving quickly. We're seeing not only, AI generated bids coming in, we're seeing AI generated protests coming in and appeals. And so not all AI is good.
I'm speaking with Jim Carroll. He's CEO of the Professional Services Council. Well, let's pull the AI thread a little bit farther because it's showing up everywhere, as you said, especially in national security. And you've got an event today, PSC on the Hill, focused on AI and national security. Talk to us about what you're going to be talking about.
We are getting ready to run up to Capitol Hill. We're having an event this morning, and we're having 12 of our 400 companies give presentations, have conversations both with members of Congress and staff on the very topic of AI and how it relates to national security. These are some of our largest companies down to some of our most innovative, smaller, 8A companies. The big ones, like AWS, GDIT, Mantech, Maximus, SAIC, but also some of the smaller ones who are really just doing great things. Golden Key Group, iWorks. There are some wonderful companies that have some amazing products in the AI space. And it's no surprise we see this conflict going on in the Middle East. And the concern is hopefully we'll contain this and no other conflicts so we can start sleeping well at night. But we know this is a very real issue, not just for what's currently happening, but going forward. And so what AI does is really help keep us ahead of any of our adversaries. And so the president has said it, Secretary Hegseth has said it, and several other, quite frankly, secretaries have said it as well, that we need, as the U.S., to be the world leader in AI. One thing we're seeing right in this area, depending which way you drive, if you're heading out towards Dulles Airport, you see data centers everywhere. We're getting more and more involved in that space. And again, that's because of the need for these things, along with the power grid, to be able to support AI. We know it's mission critical right now. I heard, over the past weekend that they're using AI. I don't know if this is true, but they were using AI in targeting for the military about whether or not they can deploy lethal force. That's an interesting use of AI capabilities. And, Terry, I'm really happy this is radio because people can't see my gray hair. But for a person who's been in D.C. their entire life, that's a new concept for using AI to decide targeting. And so this is not a hypothetical world of AI. This is real.
So, Jim, as you're having these conversations today, two questions. One, what is your main point to lawmakers about AI and national security? And two, where do you see the biggest gap between perception and reality amongst the members of Congress?
I think there are some folks who don't understand that while AI is a wonderful tool, it does not remove the humans. At the end of the day, there still must be humans looking at this, making sure that the information that goes into AI is solid. So data governance is a big issue for AI, making sure that as I said, humans are still involved in the loop, and that the security of these AI systems is paramount, that we're able to use it in such a way that it is absolutely secure. Adversaries can't tap into it. And, we're seeing it across the board, not only at the Department of War, but across the intel agencies and across everywhere. Remember yesterday, there was the plane crash at LaGuardia Airport. And one of the things that I thought about in preparation for today's meeting on the Hill is, would AI, be able to more safely deploy fire trucks onto active runways? I would like to think such preventable tragedies might not happen with more advanced use of AI. So AI is going to be part of the future of FAA provisions. We've heard Secretary of Transportation Duffy talk about this. And so, again, I just don't think we can overemphasize the reliance and overnight advances that are taking place with AI.
I've been speaking with Jim Carroll. He's CEO of the Professional Services Council. Jim, thanks for sharing those ideas with us, and good luck with the conversations today.
Thank you. We're running up to the Hill, and so we'll hopefully see a bunch of people there.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. It's been nearly 10 months since the Trump administration unveiled its merit hiring plan, and the plan has changed a bit since then, along with the administration's overall workforce goals. Strict quotas for workforce reduction are gone, for example, and there's a new emphasis on pooled recruitment for technical jobs. Scott Cooper is the director of the Office of Personnel Management. He shared a progress report with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman.
The good news is we're making really good progress on it. Obviously, last year, There was hiring in the federal government last year. There was roughly about 100,000 person hiring in the government, obviously on a net basis, of course, as you well know. The government was down from an employee base, but I would say there was very concentrated and fewer hiring actions last year. As we've gone into this new fiscal year, we've done a couple things. Number one is some of you may recall that there was an executive order last year which had a 4-to-1 kind of requirement, which was for every new position that was created, there was an obligation to basically remove 4 positions from government. As part of the a new executive order the president put in this fiscal year, we've gotten rid of that, so we don't have any kind of numerical-based quotas on it. In place of that, what we've done is we've asked all the agencies, and they've all done this, to present to us and to OMB their overall headcount plans for the year, recognizing that obviously those will change, of course, as the needs change, but at least give us a baseline, particularly to be able to start to work on a number of these merit hiring-based proposals. So what came out of that for us, and this is what we're now implementing in merit hiring, are a couple things. Number one is we now have a better sense, at least as of a snapshot in time, of what are the big categories of things that are cross-agency hirings are happening, right? So it turns out, not surprisingly, that technical jobs, there are almost every agency is hiring technical jobs. Well, as you mentioned, right, that's a perfect opportunity within the context of the merit hiring plan to do a concept of shared certificates. So we've started that. We've got an initiative called TechForce, which I'm happy to talk about, which is kind of an example of that. But we're also going to roll out several other kind of shared certificate programs. We've set a goal, which is a very ambitious goal, of trying to get to 60% shared certificate hiring, over the course of this administration. We're nowhere near that today, so it's a very, very ambitious goal. But in my mind, it's really important because it not only makes the experience for the applicant better, but it'll make the experience, obviously, and the efficiency for government much better. So in my perfect world, what I would like is for any applicant who has a skill set to be able to just tell the federal government, I'm interested, I'm a program manager, these are the skills I have, and then basically for them not to have to go through and figure out which of the 150 different agencies might actually have a job open for them. I would love for them to be able to come in at the top of the funnel, demonstrate, kind of their interest. We at OPM then will do kind of common screening, and so this goes to your other point, which is how do we assess merit for these roles. So as part of the merit hiring program, we have done away with what is an employee's self-attestation of their skills. That's been the kind of predominant method by which employees have been evaluated is, I apply for a software engineering job and I check the box that says I know Perl and I know, SQL and I know, C++, and the honest answer is we have never done an actual assessment to determine whether your self-attestation actually is consistent with what your skill set actually is. So we're no longer using self-attestations. We're using assessments, so tests that have been validated by our psychologists. And then in addition, where appropriate, like in the tech area, we are going to use specific technical tests, right? So now, if you apply to TechForce, which hopefully some of you will, or folks you will actually be assigned to take a software development test that will be kind of the first minimum criteria for you to be able to be eligible to continue in the hiring process. So it's a long way of saying, like, there's a bunch of these things doing. The whole goal in my mind is eliminate proxies and or substitutes for skills, and actually how do we measure them. The final piece of this, by the way, just so you know, is there are 609 different job classifications in the federal government. I don't know how we got to that number, but it's quite a large number. We are in the process right now of re-updating all of those and hopefully consolidating some of them down from 600 to a more reasonable number. But the main objective of that reclassification process is to eliminate, again, proxies for skill sets. So many, many federal job requirements have a requirement which says you must have a college degree. Well, to me, that tells me nothing about that individual, right? Because I don't know if they were a Russian literature, major, or if they were actually a, computer science major and they're applying for a computer science job. There's actually a relevant difference there. And so we're trying to do that. The second piece we're doing, as I mentioned, is many of the job classifications have minimum tenure requirements. So if we have a fantastic engineer who is actually performing at the level of a GS 15 or a 14, but that individual, let's say they graduated only from high school and they just came out in the workforce, because of the way the system is set up, we can only pay that individual at a GS5 or GS6 level because they have not satisfied the minimum tenure requirements. Well, again, in my mind, and people may disagree with this, that's just a silly system, right? So if we care about skills, then we should stop having proxies for skills. And so the big thing we're doing on this reclassification program is to try to eliminate anything that's a proxy for skills and then redefine the job requirements as skills-based things that we can ultimately assess through the form of some type of, formal assessment.
Yeah, thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about the Tech Force initiative, too. That I saw that you were partnering with NASA on that recently, and I believe that the initial date to kind of close out the applications, at least, was sometime in March. So can you just talk about, where that program stands right now?
Yeah, so let me give you a sense of what Tech Force is, first of all, and let me frame the problem for you. So we've got a number of challenges kind of as you look across the workforce in federal government. One of them is for particular areas of technical skills like, modern software development, AI skills, data scientists and stuff. We still have fewer people in government than we need who have that skill set. So one objective for Tech Force is just how do we start to reignite and do a better job of recruiting that skill set into government, because there's an enormous amount of modernization and technology activity, obviously, that we're trying to undertake for which we need skills.
That's Scott Cooper, the director of the Office of Personnel Management, speaking with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. You can catch the full conversation, part of our recent Guide to the Federal Chico event at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. The Defense Department is accelerating modernization for mission advantage, and Federal News Network is breaking it all down. Tuesday and Wednesday, join top leaders from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and industry as they explore AI, cloud, DevSecOps, and software factories. Don't miss it. Visit federalnewsnetwork.com to register now for the DoD Modernization Exchange. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.